On January 28, 1986, 7 astronauts died because a room full of brilliant engineers stayed silent about a problem they all understood. The technical knowledge existed to prevent the Challenger disaster. The data was available. The warnings were raised. And then a psychological phenomenon older than modern institutions quietly smothered every objection, until the only voice that mattered was the voice of consensus. You think intelligence protects groups from catastrophic error. History suggests the opposite may be true. Picture yourself in a conference room with 12 accomplished professionals. Someone proposes a strategy you immediately recognize as flawed. You glance around the table. No one objects. The conversation moves forward. You feel the words forming in your throat, the perfectly reasonable counterargument that would take 15 seconds to deliver. And then something stops you. Not fear exactly. Not certainty that you are wrong. Something more subtle. A pressure you cannot name, but can absolutely feel. You stay silent. The flawed strategy is approved. 6 months later, it fails exactly as you knew it would. And you will never be able to fully explain, even to yourself, why you said nothing when it mattered most. In 1972, a psychologist named Irving Janis published a study that would redefine how we understand organizational failure. He had been analyzing some of the most catastrophic decisions in American history. The Bay of Pigs invasion, where plans so obviously doomed that it seemed designed to fail, was approved by the brightest minds in the Kennedy administration. The escalation of the Vietnam War, where each step deeper into disaster was endorsed by experienced military strategists and foreign policy experts. The failure to anticipate the attack on Pearl Harbor despite abundant intelligence suggesting Japanese aggression was imminent. Janis was searching for a common thread, some explanatory framework that could account for how groups of intelligent, informed, well-intentioned people could arrive at decisions so spectacularly wrong that retrospective analysis makes them appear almost deliberately self-destructive. What he discovered was not a failure of intelligence, but a failure of collective psychology. He called it groupthink. It is the phenomenon where the desire for harmony and consensus in a group becomes so psychologically powerful that it overrides realistic appraisal of alternative courses of action. It is not stupidity. It is not ignorance. It is not malice. It is the systematic suppression of critical thinking in service of preserving group cohesion, and it happens most reliably in groups composed of intelligent, high-achieving individuals who share a strong sense of collective identity. The mechanism operates beneath conscious awareness, which is what makes it so dangerous. No one in the room believes they're sacrificing sound judgment for social comfort. No one experiences themselves as suppressing dissent or avoiding critical analysis. What they experience is agreement, alignment. The satisfying sense that smart people thinking together have arrived at the obviously correct conclusion. The psychological distortion is invisible to those inside it, which is precisely why it persists. In organizations that explicitly value rigorous analysis and independent thinking, Janis identified several conditions that make groupthink likely. The first is high group cohesiveness. When people feel strong bonds of loyalty and identification with their team, when belonging to the group is central to their identity and self-worth, the psychological cost of disrupting harmony escalates dramatically. Disagreement stops feeling like intellectual contribution and starts feeling like betrayal. This is counterintuitive because we generally consider cohesive teams to be desirable. We want groups where people trust each other, where communication flows easily, where shared purpose creates alignment. But that same cohesion creates a vulnerability. The stronger your attachment to the group, the more your brain will work to protect that attachment, even at the cost of truth. The second condition is insulation from outside opinions. When a group operates in relative isolation, when it primarily engages with its own members and rarely solicits input from external sources, it loses access to perspectives that might challenge its emerging consensus. This happens frequently in organizations with strong hierarchies or specialized knowledge domains. The executive team that only talks to itself. The expert committee that dismisses input from non-expert. The think tank that prizes ideological purity over intellectual diversity. The insulation is often justified as protecting focus, maintaining confidentiality, or ensuring that only qualified voices contribute. But the effect is the creation of an echo chamber where assumptions go unchallenged, and confirmation bias compounds with each iteration of internal discussion. The third condition is directive leadership. When the person with the most authority in the group makes their preference known early in deliberation, it creates a gravitational pull on the conversation. Subordinates, consciously or unconsciously, begin shaping their contributions to align with the leader's stated position. This is not necessarily conscious sycophancy, though that exists. More often, it is a cognitive shift where the leader's view becomes the default framework, and alternative perspectives get evaluated based on how much they deviate from that framework, rather than on their independent merits. The fourth condition is lack of established procedures for systematically considering alternatives. When groups do not have formal processes that require examination of multiple options, that mandate articulation of worst-case scenarios, that assigns someone the explicit role of devil's advocate, the path of least resistance is to converge on the first plausible option that achieves majority support. The human brain is lazy in the sense that it seeks cognitive efficiency. Deliberation is effortful. Disagreement is uncomfortable. If the group can reach consensus quickly, if everyone can leave the meeting feeling aligned and confident, the psychological reward is immediate. The potential cost of that premature consensus is abstract and distant. Our neurology is not built to weigh those trade-offs rationally. When these conditions align, groupthink produces a predictable set of symptoms. The group develops an illusion of invulnerability, a shared belief that because they are smart and experienced and well-intentioned, their decisions are unlikely to fail catastrophically. This is not arrogance in the conventional sense. It is a collective overconfidence born from the reassurance of consensus. If everyone agrees, we must be right. The psychological logic is seductive because it feels like due diligence. We thought about this carefully. We discussed it thoroughly. We all reached the same conclusion. What this narrative obscures is that the discussion was constrained, the thinking was convergent, rather than divergent, and the consensus was achieved through suppression of doubt, rather than resolution of it. The group engages in collective rationalization, developing shared justifications that dismiss warnings or negative feedback that might challenge the chosen course of action. This is where intelligence becomes a liability rather than an asset. Smart people are exceptionally good at generating post hoc rationalizations for decisions they have already committed to emotionally or socially. They can construct elaborate frameworks that make the preferred option appear not just reasonable, but inevitable. They can identify flaws in alternative approaches while remaining blind to equivalent flaws in their own. They can reinterpret ambiguous data to support their conclusion while holding contradictory data to an impossibly high standard of proof. The capacity for rationalization scales with cognitive ability, which means that highly intelligent groups can talk themselves into catastrophically bad decisions with more sophistication than less intelligent groups, but no more accuracy. The group develops an unquestioned belief in its inherent morality because the members are good people with good intentions. working toward good outcomes. They assume their actions are ethically sound. This belief short-circuits ethical scrutiny. If we're the good guys, then what we decide must be good. This is how groups of people who would individually recoil from deception, manipulation, or harm can collectively endorse policies that involve exactly those elements. The moral reasoning gets outsourced to group identity. We are not the kind of people who do bad things, therefore this thing we are doing cannot be bad, therefore we do not need to examine it with the rigor we would apply to actions proposed by people we trust less. The group begins to stereotype out groups as too weak, too stupid, or too immoral to pose a genuine threat or offer valid criticism. This is particularly evident in competitive or adversarial contexts. The rival company is dismissed as incompetent. The opposing political faction is caricatured as crazy or evil. The critics are framed as jealous or ignorant. This stereotyping serves a dual psychological function. It bolsters in-group cohesion through shared contempt for outsiders, and it preemptively discredits any information or perspective that might challenge the group's assumptions. If the source is already defined as unreliable, the content can be dismissed without genuine consideration. Within the group itself, direct pressure is applied to dissenters. This pressure is often subtle. Not explicit threats, but social cues that communicate disapproval. The slight pause after someone raises an objection. The collective pivot away from the uncomfortable topic. The look exchange between senior members that signals this person is not being a team player. The follow-up conversation after the meeting where the dissenter is gently reminded of the importance of unity. These micropressures are devastatingly effective because they activate our deep neurological need for social acceptance. Humans are exquisitely sensitive to signals of group disapproval because for most of our evolutionary history, exclusion from the group meant death. That ancient circuitry still governs our behavior in modern conference rooms. Self-censorship emerges as a dominant behavior. People with doubts stay silent to avoid disrupting consensus or appearing disloyal. This is the most insidious symptom because it is entirely internal. No one has to explicitly silence you. You silence yourself, and because the silencing happens in your own mind, you can tell yourself it is a rational choice rather than a psychological capitulation. I could speak up, but it is not worth the political capital. My concern is probably not significant. Someone smarter than me has surely thought of this already. These are the narratives we construct to justify our silence, and they feel reasonable in the moment. What we do not recognize is that everyone else in the room is engaging in the same internal negotiation, arriving at the same conclusion, creating a collective silence that each individual interprets as evidence, that no one else shares their doubt. This creates an illusion of unanimity. Because dissent is not voiced, the group assumes it does not exist. Silence is interpreted as agreement, and this false consensus becomes self-reinforcing. The more unanimous the group appears, the more pressure each individual feels to conform. Why am I the only one who sees a problem? Maybe I am wrong. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I should just go along. The psychological isolation of being the sole dissenter is so acutely uncomfortable that most people will revise their own judgment rather than endure it. Finally, the group develops mind guards, members who take it upon themselves to protect the group from information that might challenge its assumptions. These are not villains. They are often the most loyal and committed members, people who genuinely believe they are serving the group's interests by filtering out noise and maintaining focus. They intercept warnings before they reach decision makers. They reframe criticism as misunderstanding. They emphasize information that supports the preferred narrative while downplaying information that contradicts it. They are performing a kind of informational triage, and by their own logic, they're being helpful. What they're actually doing is ensuring that the group never encounters the reality check it desperately needs. The Challenger disaster is the textbook case study of groupthink in action. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that manufactured the solid rocket boosters, knew the O-rings would not seal properly in cold temperatures. They had data demonstrating this failure mode. They recommended delaying the launch, but the organizational culture at NASA had developed several groupthink vulnerabilities. There was intense pressure to maintain the shuttle launch schedule, which created directive leadership pushing toward approval. There was high cohesion among the decision-making group, which valued team loyalty and mission focus. There was collective rationalization of previous anomalies, with the O-rings framed as acceptable risks rather than warnings of catastrophic failure. When the engineers raised their concerns during the pre-launch teleconference, they were met with resistance. The managers wanted data proving it was unsafe to launch rather than data proving it was safe, reversing the normal burden of proof. The engineers were pressured to reconsider their recommendation. And in a moment that still haunts the historical record, the senior manager at Thiokol told the engineers to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. This was an explicit instruction to stop thinking about technical reality and start thinking about organizational politics. The engineers complied. The recommendation was reversed. The launch proceeded. 7 people died 73 seconds in a flight because a group of people who knew better allowed groupthink to override their professional judgment. The financial crisis of 2008 provides another devastating example. Investment banks, ratings agencies, and regulatory bodies all missed or dismissed warning signs of the housing bubble because groupthink had infected the entire industry. The shared assumption was that housing prices could not decline nationally, that sophisticated financial instruments had distributed risk effectively, that the smartest people in finance had everything under control. Dissenting voices, people who warned about subprime mortgage exposure or the fragility of mortgage-backed securities, were marginalized as pessimists who did not understand the new paradigm. The group consensus was so strong that it overrode individual analysis, even among people whose job was precisely to identify systemic risk. When the collapse came, it was not because information was unavailable. It was because the psychological architecture of the industry made it impossible to process that information as a serious threat. These are not isolated incidents. They are illustrations of a dynamic that operates constantly in every organization that relies on group decision-making. Corporate boards approve strategies that later prove. Medical teams miss diagnoses that individual members suspected. Juries convict innocent people when early deliberations create momentum toward guilty verdicts, and dissenting jurors feel pressure to conform. Military commands order. Operations that seasoned officers know are tactically unsound. Editorial teams publish stories that do not meet basic verification standards because everyone in the room wanted the story to be true. The challenge of groupthink is that the solutions are not intuitive and often feel counterproductive to group functioning. Creating psychological safety where dissent is genuinely welcomed requires leaders to actively reward disagreement even when it is uncomfortable. Institutionalizing devil's advocate roles where someone is formally assigned to argue against the emerging consensus can help, but only if the role is taken seriously rather than performed as a superficial ritual, requiring written individual judgments before group discussion prevents anchoring to early statements and creates a record of diverse perspectives. Seeking input from outside experts who have no stake in group cohesion introduces friction that can disrupt premature consensus. But the deepest solution is cultural and psychological. It requires recognizing that the feeling of consensus is not the same as correctness. That agreement does not equal accuracy. That the comfort of harmony is often the enemy of truth. It requires building organizations where people are rewarded for speaking uncomfortable truths, where changing your mind in response to. Evidence is celebrated rather than seen as weakness, where the question, what could we be missing, is asked obsessively even when everything seems clear. Most fundamentally, it requires humility about the limits of collective judgment. Groups are not wiser than individuals by default. Under the wrong conditions, groups make each individual dumber than they would be alone. The presence of smart people does not guarantee smart decisions. It guarantees elaborate justifications for whatever decision the group's psychology has already determined. The next catastrophic failure is being approved in a conference room right now. The people in that room are smart, experienced, and well-intentioned. They are examining data, weighing options, and reaching consensus, and they're almost certainly wrong about something critical, but no one will speak up because speaking up feels more dangerous than staying silent. Groupthink is not a bug in organizational decision-making. It is the operating system, and it runs most smoothly in groups that pride themselves on being too intelligent, too professional, too rigorous to fall victim to it. Your silence has a body count you will never see. The question is whether you will recognize it before or after the disaster. If this examination of collective failure unsettled you, share it with someone in a position to make decisions that matter. Subscribe for more investigations into the psychological mechanisms that govern institutions and destroy lives. And the next time you are in a room where everyone agrees, where consensus feels inevitable, where objections die in your throat before you voice them, remember that you are inside the very dynamic that has produced every organizational catastrophe in history. Speak anyway. Risk the discomfort. The cost of your silence is higher than you know.